The book of 2 Samuel contains a passage most readers never reach. It is not in the famous chapters. It does not appear in the Sunday school version of David's story. It appears in the late appendix to David's story, after the central political narrative has largely concluded, but before the great song and final warrior collections that complete the book. The passage lists 4 warriors. All 4 are from Gath. All 4 fall to David and his men in a series of battles that the text describes with the same casualness it uses for ordinary military encounters. Named opponents, named victors, a brief account of each encounter. And then, the text closes the sequence with a single summarizing statement. These 4 were born to Rapha in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and his servants. That collective sentence closes its local sequence. And read across the final form of the Bible, it can also function as the closest collective closing of the Gath-associated warrior tradition that the preceding books assembled, though the text itself never announces that larger connection. But what is that tradition, and where did it come from? Rapha is a name or a word. It sits in the same semantic orbit as Rephaim, the category Deuteronomy uses to classify several named giant peoples who inhabited the land before Israel's arrival. The Rephaim are described in Deuteronomy as great, many, and tall, peoples displaced by divine action, their territory reassigned to the nations that now occupy it. The Anakim are accounted Rephaim. The Emim are accounted Rephaim. Og of Bashan is called a remnant of the Rephaim. And the Anakim who survived Joshua's conquest are placed in 3 named cities, one of which is Gath. The 4 warriors the 2 Samuel passage closes out are from Gath. The connection between those 2 things is not explained by the text. It is simply there, for the reader who has been paying attention across several books and several centuries of narrative time. To understand how a clause in Genesis connects to that collective sentence in 2 Samuel, you have to go back to a single clause inserted before the flood that the text never retracts, never explains, and never resolves. Genesis 6:4 states that the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also afterward. By the end of this video, you will understand why that clause is one of the most consequential loose threads in the Hebrew Bible. The growing network of named giant peoples the text links through overlapping traditions of ancestry, classification, and geography across Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Samuel. The series of battles that progressively reduced those traditions, and why the collective sentence in 2 Samuel 21, and not the more famous encounter that preceded it, is the closest collective closing the Bible's giant traditions receive. A text that claims total destruction and then quietly preserves language that later readers understood as placing giants both before and after the flood is either preserving a visible seam in a composite tradition or deliberately retaining language later books could reuse. Or perhaps simply failing to harmonize sources that were never reconciled. Which of those it is changes how much weight the word never is allowed to carry anywhere else in the book. And the implications do not stay local. The flood is one of the Hebrew Bible's most decisive interventions. The moment the text resets the world entirely. If even that reset carries a clause the text never takes back, The reader is entitled to ask what else, in the tradition's most absolute language, might carry a similar qualification. 4 warriors from Gath, 1 collective sentence, and a thread that began, generations earlier, with a phrase nobody in Genesis thought to explain. Hold how those 2 things are connected. Genesis 6:4 is not a long verse. It does not take long to read, but the clause it preserves, in those days and also afterward, is among the most grammatically contested phrases in the Hebrew Bible. And the tension it creates with the flood narrative that follows has been recognized by commentators for centuries. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly what that tension is, why it resists a clean resolution, and why it matters that the text neither retracts the clause nor explains it. The verse introduces the Nephilim in their pre-flood context. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, found them beautiful, and took them as wives. Children were born of those unions. And then positioned immediately after this compressed account, the Nephilim are named. They were in the earth in those days. The text then adds its qualifier, and also afterward. The word afterward is doing significant work here, and the work is ambiguous. The phrase does not say the Nephilim survived the flood. It does not say they were destroyed by it either. It places them before the flood in those days, and then extends that placement forward in time with a qualifier that most readers, reading ahead to Numbers 13 and Deuteronomy 2, have understood as pointing past the flood narrative to the Anakim and the Rephaim. But that is a reading brought to the text by what comes later, not a statement the text itself makes explicit. Genesis 6:4 preserves a tension. It does not resolve one. What follows in Genesis 6 is unambiguous about the flood's scope. Verse 17, God declares that the flood will destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, swarming things, and all humankind. Everything breathing on dry land outside the ark died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Every living thing blotted out. No exceptions named. And then, a few verses earlier, in the same book, they were there. Also afterward, no explanation given. None asked for. Scholarship has approached this tension from several directions. Source-critical analysis reads, also afterward, as a residue of an older tradition that was preserved when the Nephilim passage was incorporated into the flood narrative. A clause from one source that was never updated to fit the universalist scope of the flood account it now sits beside. That is one serious reading, and it has the advantage of explaining the clause's awkward position. It sits within the Nephilim passage as a qualifier that belongs to the logic of that passage, while the flood narrative that follows it proceeds on entirely different assumptions. Others have argued the clause was deliberate, a textual note inserted by a compiler who understood what the later Anakim traditions would require, and who placed the qualifier here precisely so that the subsequent material would have permission to exist without openly contradicting the flood's stated scope. On this reading, the also afterward is not a forgotten loose end, but a controlled seam, a door that was left open on purpose. Neither reading commands consensus. Both treat the tension as real, and the clause as significant. What the clause's own grammar does not supply is certainty about its temporal reference. Also afterward can point to the period after the flood. That is the reading that produces the contradiction with Genesis 7. But the verse could also be read as establishing a temporal claim that does not require post-flood existence. The Nephilim were there before the flood, and they were there in the period that followed the age of the sons of God, without specifying that this latter period postdates the flood. That reading is strained against the narrative context, but it is grammatically available, and some interpreters have used it to dissolve the tension entirely. This episode follows the post-flood reading that produces the tension, while acknowledging the grammatical alternative. But acknowledging that the clause is genuinely ambiguous is not a concession. It is the honest position. What the clause does not supply is a mechanism. It does not tell the reader how any giant tradition survived a flood, described in the most absolute language available. It preserves language that later readers could, and frequently did, understand as placing the Nephilim both before and after the flood. That is the more defensible formulation. The text is not announcing that specific individuals swam to shore. It is leaving a door open that the flood's own language should have closed. It is also worth naming the three distinct claims that the accumulated reading of this episode often collapses together as though they were the same thing when they are not. The first is that Nephilim-associated peoples existed after the flood, a claim the subsequent books of Numbers and Deuteronomy appear to support. The second is that the same individual beings who existed before the flood survived it, a claim Genesis makes no mechanism for, and the text does not assert. The third is that a biologically continuous line of descent ran from the pre-flood Nephilim through the named post-flood peoples, a claim that requires genealogical evidence the text provides incompletely, and in one case only within a report the narrator has labeled distorted. The clause in Genesis 6:4 is doing work that points toward the first of those claims. The second and third are readings the tradition has layered onto it, sometimes carefully, sometimes not. The door stays open across the books that follow. And as the text moves through those books, it builds a tradition on the other side of that door. Not by explaining the mechanism, not by returning to the clause and resolving it, but by naming the peoples, classifying them, specifying their geography, and eventually closing their account with a sentence that Genesis never supplied for the clause that started the whole sequence. Over the next several books, multiple named peoples are connected to the same complex of giant traditions through overlapping claims of ancestry, shared classification under the Rephaim label, and consistent geographic association. By the end of this chapter, you will understand those connections clearly, and where the text's evidence is explicit, and where it is inferred rather than stated. The first link comes in Numbers 13, verse 33. 12 spies have been sent into Canaan. They return with a report. Among the things they report, the Nephilim were there, specifically the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. That phrasing uses descent language came from, rather than comparison language. It is a genealogical claim, not an analogy. That said, the text in Numbers 13, verse 32, labels this report explicitly as an evil report, a distorted, fear-driven account. The grasshopper comparison is part of that unreliable account, a measure of the spy's panic rather than the narrator's assessment. And the genealogical claim lives inside the same report. Scholarship has noted that the Septuagint does not carry the identification of the Anakim with the Nephilim at all in this verse, which raises the question of whether the association is an original tradition or a later editorial layer. The claim cannot simply be extracted from the report and treated as endorsed narration. What the text preserves is this. Within the spy's frightened account, the Anakim are connected to the Nephilim. Whether that connection represents accepted tradition, rhetorical mythologizing of a real population, or a later gloss, remains a genuinely open question. Deuteronomy picks up the terminology and extends it into something more systematic. Chapter 2, verses 10 through 11, describe the Emim, a great, many, and tall people, and immediately add, the Emim were also accounted Rephaim, as the Anakim were. Verses 20 through 21 describe a people also classified in the Rephaim register, displaced by the Ammonites. The text registers this naming plurality without apparent concern. The Israelites classify them as Rephaim, while noting that the Ammonites called them Zamzummim. Different peoples, different names for the same category. The classification the text holds on to is consistent. Rephaim. Deuteronomy 2 is doing something editorially interesting here. It is not simply listing the peoples Israel encountered. It is providing a retrospective geographical map of the region, explaining who previously inhabited land that various nations now possess. The Emim previously inhabited Moab's territory. The Zamzummim previously inhabited Ammon's. Each displacement is attributed to divine action, parallel to Israel's own displacement of the Canaanites. The displaced peoples carry different names, depending on whose territory they occupied. The Emim, as the Moabites named them, the Zamzummim, as the Ammonites called them. But in each case, the Israelite text classifies them as Rephaim, making that category less a single ethnic designation and more a regional class of ancient peoples associated with primordial size, prior habitation, and eventual displacement. The text is aware it is using a classification with fuzzy edges. It does not pretend otherwise. It simply classifies and continues. Then Deuteronomy 3, verse 11, introduces Og of Bashan, king of a territory, and calls him explicitly a remnant of the Rephaim. The text then records an object associated with his defeat, an iron bed, 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits wide, measured by the cubit of a man, reportedly still at Rabbah of the Ammonites. Scholars have noted that these dimensions match the measurements attributed to Marduk's bed in ancient Near Eastern tradition, suggesting the passage may function as royal war booty, an ideological aggrandizement rather than, or in addition to, a measurement of Og's height. Whether the bed indirectly indicates Og's physical stature, evokes royal grandeur, or carries broader ideological significance remains debated. What the text unambiguously does is associate Og with the Rephaim and mark his defeat as a notable moment in the conquest of this category of people. Ancient cubit lengths varied across periods and regions, and no single confident modern conversion should be attached to these figures. Joshua 11, verses 21 through 22, closes the conquest account of the Anakim with the precision of a military ledger. Joshua cuts them off from the hill country. Hebron, Debir, Anab, all the hill country of Judah and Israel. The geography is specific and sequential, a list of cleared locations rather than a general claim of success. The text then draws its summary. None remained in the land of Israel. And then, in the same verse that announces that summary, the exception. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. 3 cities, all 3 Philistine. One of them is Gath. The Anakim who survived the conquest are compressed into a named coastal remnant, geographically precise, clearly bounded, and apparently observed rather than inferred. The text does not tell you these cities are significant to what comes later. It does not attach a marginal note pointing forward to the Samuel narratives. It names the cities, closes the conquest account, and moves on to the next chapter's concerns. That geographic detail, Gath specifically, is what makes everything in Samuel possible. Not through a connection the text draws, but through a connection the text places and leaves for the reader. A reader who knows Joshua 11:22 reads 1 Samuel 17 with a different frame than one who does not. The text distributed the information across 2 books and several decades of narrative time, and left the connection to be made or missed. The evidence the text provides, then, is a network of overlapping associations. The Anakim connected to the Nephilim within the spies report. The Emim and Zamzummim classified as Rephaim alongside the Anakim. Og called a remnant of the Rephaim. Anakim remnants placed specifically in Gath. The network is real and consistent across multiple books. What it does not establish is a single biological family line, traceable from the pre-flood Nephilim through every subsequent population. Some links are explicit, some are classificatory, and some, including the foundational Anakim-Nephilim link, sit inside a report the text itself flags as distorted. The tradition is connected. It is not uniformly documented. And Gath is where the thread goes next. The case that all of this is warrior hyperbole rather than a literal giant tradition has genuine scholarly support. By the end of this chapter, you will understand that case and why the text's own choices, considered carefully, point towards something more deliberate than pure metaphor, while stopping short of proving biological continuity. The comfortable reading runs as follows: Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim. These are ancient Near Eastern idioms for formidable, terrifying enemies. Every warrior culture in the ancient world exaggerated its opponents. The Assyrians described enemies as mountains and floods. The Egyptians spoke of defeated peoples in terms no historian reads as physical measurement. The Mari texts describe opponents in ways that clearly function as conventional military amplification rather than reported height. The Hebrew Bible participates in this rhetorical register. Goliath's armor in 1 Samuel 17 is described in such extraordinary physical detail that some historians have read even that famous passage as literary amplification of a real but more ordinary warrior. On this reading, the giant peoples are dramatized enemies, tall, well-organized, militarily experienced soldiers described in the conventional language of military fear and superlative rhetoric. The Nephilim descent claim in Numbers is part of a panicked report that the text explicitly labels as distorted. The post-flood appearances of these names are rhetorical continuations of an idiom the tradition found useful for describing peoples that Israel found genuinely formidable. The flood contradiction evaporates because there was never a literal giant bloodline to survive or fail to survive. This reading has genuine force. The etymology of Nephilim is contested, most commonly linked to the Hebrew root for to fall, yielding either the fallen ones or those who cause others to fall, with neither reading commanding consensus among Hebrists. The Septuagint's choice of gigantes is a translation decision carrying its own cosmological freight, mapping a Hebrew figure onto a Greek mythological category rather than providing a neutral rendering of the original. Warrior hyperbole is documented across ancient Near Eastern literature, and the Numbers report's explicit label as an evil report. The narrator's designation, not a later interpreter's, creates a genuine problem for extracting a hard genealogical claim from it. An episode built around unresolved textual tensions has to take the demythologizing reading seriously, because it is not a modern skeptical imposition. It has significant scholarly support, and it addresses a real vulnerability in the literalist reading. But the text makes specific choices that a purely rhetorical reading does not account for. The hyperbole interpretation does not require the Anakim, Emim, or Zamzummim to be imaginary. Real peoples can inhabit cities, be conquered, be classified, and still be described through mythic or military amplification. So military campaigns and geographic addresses do not, on their own, refute rhetorical shaping of these traditions. What the hyperbole reading cannot explain away is the deliberate structure of the classification system. Deuteronomy does not say these peoples were frightening like the Rephaim. It says they were accounted Rephaim. Og is not described as warrior-like in the Rephaim style. He is called a remnant of the Rephaim. These are classification claims, using genealogical and taxonomic vocabulary, applied consistently across multiple books and multiple peoples. A rhetorical epithet for fearsome enemies does not usually receive its own classification system, applied retroactively to 3 separate nations, with geographic precision about where surviving members were last located. There is also something worth noting in what the Deuteronomy classification register is doing as a literary act. The same text that classifies the Emim and Zamzummim as Rephaim is also providing a theological argument about divine geography. Each giant people was dispossessed by divine action, parallel to Israel's own experience. The classification as Rephaim is not simply a description of physical type, it functions. as part of an argument about history and land. If Rephaim were purely rhetorical epithets for scary neighbors, the theological machinery in Deuteronomy 2 would be operating entirely at the level of atmosphere. The text treats the classifications as something more substantive than that. Whether the text is correct is a different question, but its intention is legible. The hyperbole reading may explain the extraordinary scale attributed to these peoples, and even the primordial ancestry rhetoric in the spies report. What it does not dissolve is the final text's deliberate network of names, classifications, and locations. The giant tradition is textually real, even if its biological and physical claims remain shaped by rhetoric. That is the midpoint of this episode. What follows is not a proof of literal biological descent from pre-flood beings. That proof is not available in the text, and this episode does not offer it. What the second half follows is a textual tradition, one that accumulated across several books, connected by consistent vocabulary and specific geography, and that eventually produced, in its Gath warrior sequence, a collective close the Genesis clause never received. The Gath exception in Joshua is where that tradition was compressed into a named location and left. The text did not explain what it meant for survivors of that tradition to be placed there. It simply gave the address. Joshua's campaign leaves Anakim in 3 named cities. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what 1 Samuel makes of that geographic residue, and why the encounter in the Valley of Elah is the most famous moment in this tradition's closing sequence, rather than its final moment. 1 Samuel 17 is among the most narrated chapters in the Hebrew Bible. The encounter in the Valley of Elah has accumulated centuries of commentary, artistic representation, and theological interpretation. What this episode needs from it is more specific and more limited than a retelling. What does the text choose to tell you about Goliath before the contest begins? He is from Gath. The text names his city in the chapter's opening description, and again, at several points within the narrative. Gath is one of the 3 cities where Joshua's conquest explicitly left Anakim remaining. The geographic correspondence is exact and available to any reader who has come from Joshua 11. 1 Samuel does not alert you to it. It does not insert a genealogical link, does not call Goliath an Anakite or a Rephaite or a descendant of the peoples Deuteronomy classified. It gives you his city. The connection between Joshua's named exception and this named warrior from that city is real and geographically precise, and the text leaves you to make it or not. What 1 Samuel 17 does not do is connect Goliath explicitly to the Rapha/Rephaim category that 2 Samuel 21 will use. The word Rapha does not appear in the Goliath narrative. The word Rephaim does not appear in 1 Samuel 17. The classification vocabulary that Deuteronomy established and that 2 Samuel will invoke is absent from the chapter that makes Goliath famous. This is important. The Goliath story's place within the giant tradition rests primarily on geography, Gath, and on the physical description of his armor and height. The explicit genealogical connection to the Rapha/Rephaim category comes only in the later chapter, which names its warriors under that designation directly. The connection is real and the geography is precise, but the textual weight of it sits in 2 Samuel, not in 1 Samuel's valley of Elah. 1 Samuel 17:4 identifies Goliath as a champion. The Hebrew term Ish Habanaim, a man of the between space, referring to a warrior who fights in the gap between two armies and gives his height. The Masoretic text, the Hebrew manuscript tradition underlying most modern translations, gives 6 cubits and a span. The Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript, 4 Q Samuel A, along with the Septuagint, gives 4 cubits and a span. Both readings are on the manuscript record, and neither can be declared definitive without remainder. Textual scholars have argued over which is earlier. The Masoretic figure pushes towards the outer limit of the tradition's scale language, while the 4 Q Samuel A figure is large, but within the human range. This manuscript difference sits alongside the Elhanan discrepancy the episode will reach shortly. The text around Goliath is not a clean tradition. It has the seams the episode's argument depends on. Goliath falls. The most famous moment in this tradition's closing sequence ends in the valley of Elah. But 1 Samuel does not present it as a conclusion. There is no closing statement after Goliath's death that ties him to a genealogical category, names the tradition he belonged to, or marks his fall as the ending of anything larger than a duel. The narrative continues without a pause. David is brought to Saul's court. The friendship with Jonathan, the growing conflict between Saul and the shepherd who killed the Gittite champion. Goliath's death is the beginning of David's public story, not the end of the Gath tradition. Many chapters later in the book's literary arrangement, the late appendix returns to Philistine wars and to warriors from Gath linked with the Ha-Rapha designation, a term plausibly related to the Rephaim traditions classified in Deuteronomy and geographically associated with the Anakim remnant Joshua had placed in Gath. Joshua supplies the Anakim Gath geography. 2 Samuel supplies the Ha-Rapha designation. Reading them together creates the connection. Neither passage explicitly equates the two terms, nor does any verse in the sequence announce the connection to what began in Genesis. The link is there for the reader who has been carrying the earlier passages. The text deposits it and moves on. And this time, the appendix supplies what the Goliath narrative withheld: a collective summary, a complete list, a closing formula the earlier encounter never provided. One of 3 cities was Gath. One warrior from that city, famous across generations. He was the most famous one to fall. He was not the only one the tradition preserved. 1 Samuel does not call Goliath's death a conclusion. It does not close a genealogical chapter. The narrative moves on to David's consolidation of power, the conflict with Saul, the political aftermath. And then, considerably later, in a section of appendices that most readers never reach, the text returns to Gath. 2 Samuel 21, verses 15 through 22, contains a passage that the episode built around Goliath was always missing. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what this passage does, the 4 warriors it names, the Ha-Rapha designation it applies to them, and the closing formula it supplies. And you will understand why it arrives with a textual problem The episode cannot, in good conscience, leave unaddressed, because that problem sits at the center of the tradition the episode has been tracing. The chapter begins with a war between Israel and the Philistines. David is in the battle and becomes exhausted. One of the Philistine warriors, Ishbi-Benob, whose name the text preserves, along with his weaponry and his intention to kill David, is about to strike when Abishai, son of Zeruiah, intervenes and kills him. The text then identifies Ishbi-Benob using the Hebrew designation Ha-Rapha. That term, rendered variously in translations as Rapha, the giant, or connected to the Rephaim, appears here as a designation for this category of Gath warrior. Its relationship to the Rephaim classification Deuteronomy, deployed for the pre-conquest giant peoples, is highly suggestive and widely recognized in scholarship, though the precise semantic force of the singular Ha-Rapha versus the plural Rephaim remains a matter of some debate. A subsequent battle produces Saph, connected to the same Ha-Rapha designation, falling to Sibbecai the Hushathite. And then the text reaches its most contested verse. 2 Samuel 21:19 states, in the Masoretic text, that Elhanan's son of Jare-Oregim killed Goliath the Gittite, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. That is a problem. 1 Samuel 17 attributes Goliath's death to David. 2 Samuel 21:19 attributes it to Elhanan. The parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 25 resolves the discrepancy by a different route. There, Elhanan kills Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. The words, the brother of, are not present in the Masoretic wording of 2 Samuel. Several prominent English translations insert the brother of into Samuel to harmonize the accounts. But that harmonization is a textual decision made by translators, not a reading supported by the Samuel manuscript. An episode explicitly structured around unresolved textual seams, around a text that admits its own contradictions without explaining them. Cannot note the Genesis 6:4, tension and omit the larger one, sitting in the same tradition. The Bible's own closing sequence of Gath encounters contains two accounts of who killed Goliath that do not agree with each other. The honest position is this: the Elhanan/Goliath/Lahmi discrepancy is a documented and unresolved manuscript problem. Whether the Samuel text originally said something closer to Chronicles and was corrupted, or whether Chronicles harmonized a tradition that Samuel preserved in its earlier and more difficult form, is a textual question that scholarship has not settled. What the text gives you is two accounts in disagreement, which fits the episode's larger argument better than a clean resolution would. A further battle produces a warrior described as a man of extraordinary stature, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, who falls to Jonathan, son of Shimei, David's nephew. 2 Samuel 21:22 closes the local warrior sequence with a collective statement. These 4 were born to Rapha in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and his servants. 1 Chronicles 20 preserves essentially the same closing formula for the parallel series. Both versions agree on what they are closing, even when they disagree over one of the names. That collective sentence does something Genesis never did for its Nephilim notice, and Joshua never did for its named Gath exception. It assembles a defined group, assigns them a location, and closes their account with a collective verb. The text does not announce that this closes anything beyond its immediate warrior series. The text does not draw a line back to Genesis 6:4, or to the Deuteronomy catalogs, or to the Anakim who survived into Gath. It names the category, records the defeats, and draws the summary. Read across the final form of the Bible, that local sequence can function as the literary endpoint for the giant traditions the preceding books assembled. But that reading is a canonical synthesis, not a declaration the text makes for itself. The connection is available to the reader who has followed the trail. The text leaves it there without comment. 4 warriors from Gath. 1 closing formula, preserved in 2 versions that disagree over one of the names. All of them fell. The reader who followed the earlier traditions is left to decide whether this local close also functions as their literary endpoint. Outside the Chronicles parallel, no later narrative book develops the Gath Rapha warrior tradition further. The word Rephaim continues most prominently elsewhere, in a register that has nothing to do with military campaigns at all. After the Gath battles, Rephaim does not disappear from the Hebrew Bible. It survives, but in a completely different register. By the end of this chapter, you will understand what the word becomes in the poetic and wisdom literature, what one later rabbinic tradition attempted to do with the silence Genesis left open, and why the original tension in Genesis 6:4 is still sitting exactly where it started. The same word that Deuteronomy uses to classify the Rephaim peoples later appears in the poetic and wisdom books as a term for something else entirely. In Isaiah 14, verse 9, the shades of the dead in Sheol are stirred to greet a fallen king, and the word used is Rephaim. In Psalm 88, verse 10, the psalmist asks whether God works wonders for the dead, whether the Rephaim rise up to praise him. In Job 26, verse 5, the Rephaim tremble beneath the waters. In each passage, the word refers not to military populations, but to the weakened inhabitants of the underworld, the dead, the shades, figures without power or presence in the world of the living. The relationship between the two usages is a live scholarly question. Some scholars have proposed that the connection is real and intended. The giant warriors of the conquest narratives became the underworld shades after their defeat, the most powerful earthly figures reduced, after death, to the most powerless inhabitants of the realm below. That reading finds parallels in ancient Near Eastern traditions, where the spirits of dead heroes persist in the underworld with some residual identity. Whether the Hebrew Bible intends that continuity, or whether the two usages are independent and only coincidentally share a word, is not resolvable from the text itself. What is observable is the direction of travel, if the connection is real, from the most physically formidable figures in the narrative books to the trembling dead beneath the waters in the wisdom literature. In Joshua, the Anakim become one named target within the wider conquest campaign. In 2 Samuel 21, warriors linked with the Ha-Rapha designation fall to David and his men. The Rephaim of the poetry are already fallen, already beneath, already past. Deuteronomy 2, meanwhile, notes without apparent concern that the Moabites called the people of their former territory Emim, and the Ammonites called the people of theirs Zamzummim. The same category of peoples, different names depending on which neighboring nation was doing the naming. That naming plurality is already inside the text. The possibility that the same word carries different semantic weight in different literary registers is not, from the tradition's perspective, an anomaly. It is something the text was already comfortable acknowledging. What the sequence from 2 Samuel 21 to Isaiah 14 may be tracing, if the connection between the two usages is real, is an arc from the most physically present figures in the narrative. Warriors named, measured, and collectively defeated. To the most physically absent figures in the poetry, the shades who cannot rise, the dead who tremble beneath the waters. In Joshua, the Anakim become one named target within the wider conquest campaign, their remnant compressed into 3 coastal cities. The warriors linked with the Ha-Rapha designation in 2 Samuel cannot rise, cannot answer, cannot resist. The Rephaim of the poetry are already fallen, already beneath, already past. Whether that arc was intended by the tradition, or whether it is a connection available only to the reader who follows the word across the full span of the canon, is precisely the kind of question the text neither asks nor answers. Return now to Genesis 6:4, with the full trail behind it. Read across the assembled text. The also afterward clause can function almost like a permission note, available for later books to build giant traditions on without forcing an explicit contradiction with the flood narrative. That literary effect does not remove the tension with the flood, it preserves both sides of it. Whether the clause was placed there by a compiler who understood what the subsequent material would need, or whether it is the residue of a source tradition that predated the flood narrative's universalist scope, is exactly the kind of question that critical scholarship on Genesis has been producing serious work on for more than 2 centuries without arriving at consensus. The tension the clause creates was felt as a problem by interpreters long before modern scholarship named it. The rabbinic tradition tried to answer it. In Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, Og of Bashan is placed beside the ark, surviving on a piece of wood. In a Talmudic elaboration, the water around the ark was miraculously cooled so that Og could survive outside it. Later retellings, texts at some distance from the earliest rabbinic sources, add the detail of Noah feeding him through an opening. Each version of the legend is rabbinic agada, later interpretive tradition, not scriptural text, produced by communities of interpreters who recognize the same gap this episode has been following, and who felt a need the biblical text itself declined to feel. The compulsion to supply a mechanism is significant in its own right. The rabbis were attentive readers. They saw the gap. They built a bridge across it. The scripture left the gap open. What Genesis declined to supply is not just a mechanism for survival, but an acknowledgement that a mechanism is needed. The flood narrative in chapters 6 and 7 proceeds on the premise that the flood's scope is total, and the outcome is not in question. The also afterward clause sits in a passage that the flood narrative then moves past without returning to. In the final form of the text, the clause remained available for later readers to connect with the Anakim and Rephaim traditions. Whether that availability was deliberately engineered by a compiler who understood what the subsequent material would require, or whether it resulted from the preservation of an older source that predated the flood narrative's universalist scope, remains unresolved. A composite text can preserve precise geographic lists in one unit and unharmonized seams between different units. One does not disprove the other. What the text did not do is retract the clause, correct it, or supply the explanation that would close the gap. The silence is the text's, and it has always been the text's. It has never been explained, and no later revision closed it. The tension on the record. Genesis 6 states its scope without qualification. Every living thing blotted out. Nothing breathing on dry land outside the ark. And then, a few verses earlier in the same chapter, the text preserves a clause that many later readers understood as placing the Nephilim both before and after the flood. The tension between those two claims is not a modern construction imposed on a text that doesn't feel it. Commentators recognized it long before source criticism gave it a vocabulary. The rabbinic tradition felt the gap acutely enough to construct a legend around it. The text does not explain the relationship between the claims. It does not retract either of them. It places them in proximity and moves on, leaving the reader to hold the contradiction or dissolve it into a reading the text itself does not supply. The Bible's giant map, the Anakim connected to the Nephilim within the spies' hostile report in Numbers, a descent claim, inside a report the text labels distorted, and missing from the Septuagint entirely. The Emim and Zamzummim, classified as Rephaim, alongside the Anakim in Deuteronomy, a classification system serving a theological argument about divine geography and the displacement of ancient peoples. Og called a remnant of the Rephaim, his iron bed recorded with dimensions that may evoke royal ideology as much as physical stature, his defeat serving as military and ideological evidence. The tradition is connected across multiple books, consistent in its vocabulary. It is not a continuous biological genealogy, traceable from the pre-flood Nephilim to the warriors of Gath, with uniform documentary explicitness. The geographic precision. Joshua eliminates the Anakim from the hill country and names the 3 cities where some remained: Gaza, Gath, Ashdod. The text keeps the forwarding address in the same verse that declares the conquest complete. That address is what makes everything in Samuel possible. The most famous warrior from Gath, Goliath from the city Joshua named, falls to David in the valley of Elah. His height preserved in 2 manuscript traditions that disagree: 6 cubits and a span in the Masoretic text, 4 cubits and a span in 4 Q Samuel-A and the Septuagint. His encounter is the most famous moment in this tradition's closing sequence. The text does not tell you it is not the last one. It simply continues. The closest collective close, 2 Samuel. 21 names 4 warriors, all from Gath, all born to Rapha, all falling to David and his men. Ishbi bin Nub, Saph, a 6-fingered warrior, and a 4th whose name is the subject of the episode's 2nd major textual seam. The summarizing sentence closes them out together and names the category, the location, and the agent of their defeat. 1 Chronicles 20 preserves the parallel. Read across the final form of the Bible, this local warrior sequence, is the closest thing the Gath Rapha tradition receives to a collective closing, a defined group, a location, a collective verb. The text itself makes no announcement that this closes anything beyond its local unit. The connection to what began in Genesis 6 is a canonical synthesis. It is one the final form of the text makes available, not one it declares. The unresolved seam inside the ending. Elhanan's opponent is Goliath the Gittite in the Masoretic Samuel. In 1 Chronicles 25, Elhanan kills Lami, the brother of Goliath. Several prominent English translations harmonize Samuel to Chronicles by inserting the brother of into the Samuel verse. But those words are absent from the Hebrew of Samuel. Whether Samuel was corrupted or Chronicles harmonized a tradition it found theologically awkward is a textual question scholarship has not settled. The episode that began with an ambiguous clause in Genesis 6:4 ends with a documented discrepancy inside its own closing sequence. Both Samuel and Chronicles preserve a comparable closing formula for the local warrior unit. They do not agree on the identity of one of the men within it. What the Bible does, instead of explaining, outside the Chronicles parallel, no later narrative book develops the Gath Rapha warrior sequence further. The term Rephaim continues most prominently in the poetic and wisdom literature as a term for the powerless dead in Sheol, the shades who cannot rise, the dead who tremble beneath the waters. The Genesis clause that started this trail remains exactly as ambiguous as it was on the day someone first set it down. Genesis never tells you what and also Afterward refers to, or how the giant traditions found in later books relate to a flood described in universal terms. It never specifies whether the phrase points to survival, renewed emergence, a different chronology, or the preservation of an older tradition that the flood narrative never fully absorbed. The text offers no mechanism, no explanation, not even an acknowledgement that an explanation is needed. What the subsequent books do offer is a trail, a network of giant associated peoples connected by overlapping classification, shared geography, and consistent vocabulary, running from Numbers through the late appendix of 2 Samuel. The connections in that network vary in strength. Some are explicit genealogical claims inside a report the text labels distorted. Some are classificatory equations. Some are geographic correspondences the text places without comment. The trail is real. Its links are unequal. And it receives something Genesis's clause never did: a collective sentence naming a defined group, a location, and their collective defeat. And even that sentence survives in two versions that disagree over one of the names. The clause in Genesis 6:4 is still there. It was never retracted. It was never explained. The rabbinic explanations accumulated around it without altering it, filling the interpretive space, the silence left open, without closing the silence itself. Maybe that is the most honest thing the tradition could have given you. A text that preserves an unexplained qualifier, tracks something across centuries of narrative time with notable geographic and classificatory consistency, closes it with a collective defeat, and still can't agree in its final act on exactly who fell.